Cannibals. This is a title which I wanted to put in because it's one of the lovely chapters in Montaigne's essays, where, as usual, it starts off perhaps on cannibals and then wanders off into all sorts of speculations about the world and his times. So it's a nice title, but it's also thought-provoking, because what do we mean by cannibals? Most people, and I as an anthropologist, mean normally it's the occasion when one human being eats another human being. You eat your own species. It might be humans, or it might be spiders eating other spiders, or whatever. It's consumption of within your own species. And anthropologists have investigated, because they were one of the early things when the West encountered the rest, was the discovery of civilizations where cannibalism was quite widespread. There were arguments at one point about which said that anthropologists and observers had invented it and they'd misunderstood what they were hearing and seeing. But there's been subsequent work which shows definitely that in quite a few places there has been cannibalistic activity. Sometimes it's necessary in times of famine or food shortage. In others, it's tied up with certain rituals and it only occurs on certain occasions. So there are many variations. I don't think you can mainly explain it in terms of nutritional needs. But what happens is that you classify the object of your cannibalism usually as someone who, although of your species, is sufficiently unlike yourself to make it reasonable to eat them. There's no sense of revulsion. There are, of course, terrible accounts of cannibalism during famines in China, right up to the early end of the 19th century, and perhaps in the great famines in the Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s even, there was reported cannibalism. And you have to ask yourself, if you were dying the excruciating death of famine, and there was a corpse there that had just recently died, would you just leave it there, or would you, to the dogs, or would you, and your children were starving, would you pick it up and cut it into pieces and serve it up? Each of us would give a separate answer to that. But cannibalism clearly does exist and has many functions. But it's all a matter of classification of the other. And what I thought was an interesting sideline on cannibalism is my growing realization that I have, through much of my life, been a cannibal. And that's because we're increasingly recognizing that we are animals. I think I was brought up with the idea that, of course we are animals, everyone knows that, but we're not really animals. Animals are different. They don't have all our intelligence or our morality or whatever it was. So they are okay to eat. So for my first years, I would eat very intelligent animals like pigs, let alone cows, sheep, and so on. There were things I wouldn't eat which were perhaps a little too close, like dogs and cats, i.e. I wouldn't eat pets. But domesticated animals, fine. And it was really only under the influence of my mother, who was a Buddhist and later a vegetarian, and just really to experiment, that I became a vegetarian of kinds when I was about 19. And since then, I've been a very mild social vegetarian. In other words, if someone invites me to a meal and they've cooked, not knowing they've cooked me a piece of meat, I will, out of politeness, eat it, though try to remember to tell them next time not to cook it for me. So social relations trump morality in this case, but I've become increasingly aware of the closeness of ourselves to animals, tiny differences, And eating now, actually, it started as a moral objection, a health objection, an economic objection. Now I actually would feel repugnance if someone put a slice of, or steak, or a sausages and bacon on my plate. I would probably, even if they were friends, I'd say, sorry, I really can't eat this. It makes me feel a bit queasy, which it does. It's got to that extent. Although it's mild and graded. For example, if it's an animal that appears to be only half the kind of intelligence of a pig or a cow. In other words, if you cut off its head and it goes on for a while squawking, or at least not squawking, but moving around like fish or chickens, headless things which still seem to have some reflexes and movement, then I feel its brain is sufficiently small that I could eat it. So I sometimes eat chicken or game or fish. And I feel that this antipathy will spread. Now, why it's worth thinking about this is that we are not only more aware of how closely we are linked to our fellow animals and how we are extinguishing and destroying them, but one way that we are destroying them is through our constant, endless pressure on their environments, and above all on their forested environments. And the destruction of the forests of New Guinea and the Pacific, of Amazonia, of Central Africa, are tragic to behold. And when we are reminded that one of the main reasons for that is our love of animal flesh, that we feed huge amounts of grain and soya and so on to animals to fatten them up, and how inefficient this is, how destructive it is, and we cut down the forests of Amazonia to graze cattle for our steaks. Realizing all this, and realizing that if we bit the bullet or gave up animal eating, which is perfectly possible now, there are many synthetic animal fibers which don't require all this energy input, which taste just the same and could easily be substituted. If we did that, we would cut down the ozone gases and the destruction of many wonderful species. So if only we could extend the idea of cannibalism not just to other human beings who we would tend not to eat, but to all animals, and that might even include fish. And then our world would take a huge leap forward in terms of avoiding the major catastrophe of the 21st century, ecological destruction, not only of ourselves, but of all the other animals and plants on this planet. So cannibalism should be avoided, including interspecies, that is, within animal species, devouring of lesser, as we saw them, animals.